Today, we're welcoming Dr. Evan Friss, author of The Bookshop, published by Viking. Uh, Welcome. Thank you so much for doing the interview today. I'm going to launch right into it. You've written a lot about history, especially bicycling. Why pivot to bookstores now?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me here for this conversation. I appreciate it. Um, Both bicycles and bookstores emerged from a rather personal interest. So I was studying American history as a graduate student in New York City, and I like to bike around as a way of both recreation and also utility, the kind of sometimes easiest way to get from A to B, but it was very challenging to do so. And naturally began wondering about the kind of historical choices that were made, which encouraged or discouraged us to get in a car or a cab or take the subway or ride a bicycle. So, and I was living in the middle of a big urban environment and thought a lot about the history of urban planning, cities, and neighborhoods. And my interest in bookstores started similarly. So I was studying American history, and my girlfriend, now wife, lucked into a job at a famed indie bookstore in the West Village. And it was through her experience that I began to realize how special these spaces could be for at least a subset of the American population. And like the sort of bicycling environment, I was wondering why there weren't more bookstores. And I had lived through over the course of my own life this great decline in the number of bookstores. And so asked similar kind of historical questions about, um, what makes American neighborhoods and characters. And I was familiar with the fact that there were all these different cycling cultures in European countries, and that maybe literary cultures and bookstores were thriving more elsewhere than in the States. So I thought about diving into the history and writing about how they've changed over time.
So, was that your original goal for the book? Did it change at all during your research?
So I had the kind of very loose skeletal idea for writing something about bookstores probably 15 years ago, but it wasn't a very serious idea. And I knew, I mean, as a historian, it was going to be historical in some way, but I really didn't have any idea about the scope, either chronologically or geographically, or the kind of central animating questions. And I wrote one book about bikes and assumed I was going to write this bookstore book next, but something else kind of fell into my lap. So this project got delayed, and it wasn't until I really started thinking about it more earnestly 5 years ago that it took the shape that it did, this kind of survey history of the American bookstore, what it's meant to American cultural life, how they've been important economic players, how they've shaped political ideologies, um, and why we still need them. So that kind of framing came to the fore really when I started working on this book, which was about 5 years ago.
So you're tracking the evolution of a very influential industry. It could be seen as a business book as much as a history book. Did you kind of set out to write a different type of business book or history book?
Not so much. It's been characterized. If you go on, Amazon, which finds ways of listing books as, a bestseller, and it was for a while a bestseller in commerce, which makes sense. But not that it was a bestseller, but it makes sense that it would be considered a book about commerce. And it made a New York Times list of business books, which I guess technically also makes sense. And I'm not complaining, and I'm very happy to be there. But most of the other books are much more obviously, or what we think of as kind of books you would find in the business bay at a bookstore today about habits, developing kind of leadership potential, and books like Seven Highly Effective Habits of People, or whatever that book is called. And Malcolm Gladwell and other kinds of authors who very much pitch their writing to that market. So these are, of course, businesses. And one of the things that struck me as so interesting about bookstores is how they read as less business-like than most other businesses, and how so many of the people who get into book selling are driven primarily not by financial motive or the idea that they're going to get rich doing it.
Mhm. We have a lot of writers and editors among the AuthorLink followers. So why don't you tell us a bit about the process that you used to create the book, about how long it took to research it, to write it, and to edit it?
So I'm a professor of history here at James Madison University, and as somebody with a PhD in history who went to graduate school, um, I wanted this to be a popular, accessible, and hopefully entertaining book to read. But I also am steeped in the methods of being an academic. So I knew it was going to take a while, and I wanted to do the research on my own, going to archives and libraries around the country, digging through boxes and file folders and photographs and receipts and all sorts of other kinds of documents. So there was a lot of research, and I kind of interweave the research and writing simultaneously,
Mhm.
go to a collection and sort of work on one chapter at a time. So the research is vital to me, and I wanted the book to be deeply researched, but to have that research wear lightly, and so that it doesn't read like an academic or overly scholarly book, but that hopefully those insights come across just in a more digestible way. And it took me quite a long time to write. Like everyone, I suppose, this book that came out in August was, my 70th draft or something. I have no idea. Um, but I write and then I write and rewrite and edit. And then, of course, professional editor, my editor at Viking came in with his own suggestions, and then I responded. And um, so it takes me a long time before I'm happy with it. Even if I can get words on the page, I do a lot of writing and rewriting. And for this book, my first two books were more academic in nature and were published by university presses. So the process of publishing the bookshop was very different because I had to get an agent ahead of time, which is basically how you can, break into the mainstream traditional publishing world by getting an agent who's convinced that this has, some viability and commercial value to then pitch it to the big publishers.
Is that how you connected with Viking, or were there other people that you knew who were publishing with them and who introduced you? How did you make that connection solid?
So I began by querying a bunch of different agents, and some of them are interested, some of them weren't. And then once my agent was on board, she takes the lead in terms of then pitching the book to Viking and other publishers, some of whom weren't interested, some of whom were. And the ones that are interested, eventually we have meetings where we kind of feel each other out and see if this would be a good relationship. And then they make various offers, and the author and his or her agent basically then just decide where we want to go.
Did your research show any surprises? Were there any particular aha moments for you?
One surprising thing throughout the history of American bookselling is how precarious of a business it is. So, as somebody who lives through this great decline in the number of bookstores, and was privy to the kind of you've got mail narrative and saw lots of indie bookstores closing, this felt like a very recent kind of phenomenon. And I write in the book about this notion of a kind of golden age of bookstores always being one or two generations before whatever era we're living in. But book selling in all ages seems to have been a kind of imperiled business. And there were lots of different challenges in the colonial bookstores that I begin with. Most American colonists are not literate. That's a big problem. People don't have a lot of money. Books are very expensive then. Then come later in the 19th century public libraries, which present this seemingly great threat because people can access books for free. And then, of course, even in the early 20th century, the advent of radios and then television, movies, these were seen as the end of reading and the kind of death of book selling. And of course, none of them turned out to be. So I was surprised at by the degree to which this rhetoric of book selling as sort of near death is has been so durable.
I love that. You captured so many people's stories in this book. There are a lot of characters in this book. How did you find and choose among all of them?
It was hard, certainly, to pick which bookstores and booksellers to profile. As you could imagine, this book spans hundreds of years and all of the United States. And there are a lot of important people and a lot of colorful characters that, by necessity, either got short shrift or were omitted entirely. But the ones that I chose were a combination. If I had the sources that I could portray the characters, I thought, in a full enough manner. So I didn't want to write about people for whom I didn't feel comfortable writing about them because I didn't have the materials and the documentation to really bring their stories to life. So that was certainly part of it. And I also wanted to show a kind of diversity of bookstores and booksellers. And I was trying to highlight how the model of the American bookstore changed over time. So in different eras, there were different kinds of bookstores that were essentially the paragon. So some of it was a kind of desire to have some balance of different and to showcase different types of bookstores and different types of booksellers combined with practically where I could tell the most fruitful and interesting stories.
So even though each of those characters seems unique in their own right and their own context, what commonalities did you find among them?
A lot of them were remarkably courageous. And as I mentioned before, bookselling has never been a terribly lucrative position. So many of the people who started their own bookstores did so at great cost, turning down other kinds of career paths. I highlight some booksellers who were interested in activist campaigns. They were promoting civil rights. There's a chapter about a black bookstore that opens in the late 60s in Washington, D.C. These were people who were activists, who were doing protest marches. And, the bookstore was just part of an anchor of a much larger campaign. And for many people, not just those who were politically oriented, they entered the business because they wanted to match readers with books and to share a love of literature. And were so passionate about whatever their end goal was that they were willing, to risk a lot and sacrifice a lot.
Can you talk about one or two of your very favorite interviewees?
Sure. Well, one person I never interviewed, but I wish I did, was this woman named Frances Steloff, who started the Gotham Book Mart. And this was just such a quirky, fascinating woman who opened this avant-garde, artsy bookstore in Manhattan. And she created this real home for modernist authors and introduced people to literature that was banned in the United States and kind of, very some esoteric kind of work. And she created just a home and a community for a lot of outcast kind of artists. And she just seems so quirky and plucky. Somebody, and I did a lot of oral history interviews with people for the book. And one of my favorite, this wasn't really a full length interview, but I was at this bookstore in the northern knob of Manhattan interviewing the owner. And in walks this guy, a customer, and the owner tells me that he's a regular and that he used to work at a lot of bookstores over the course of his career. So I go over and talk to him and I say, I'm writing this book. Can I interview you about your bookstore experience? And he said, no. And he just walked away. And then, like 5 minutes later, he comes over to me and starts talking. And the first thing he says is, bookstores are weird. And then he proceeds to sort of elaborate slightly, although not very much about what he meant. But I love that phrase, and that's really kind of the heart of my book is to think about what makes bookstores weird, because I think they are distinct, and we could sort of euphemistically call them unique or special, right? Which might be a nicer way of saying weird. But they are really unlike any other kind of retail space. And weird can be wondrous and wonderful. And that's what I tried to explore in this book.
One of the other common threads amongst a number of your chapters was showing how books and booksellers, and you did touch on this a short moment ago, about using them to build and advance social and racial justice. Efforts to quash books have gone on for decades and decades. I wondered if your research showed any examples of where book banning or book squashing has halted social change in any way.
Well, it's interesting to see how the kind of tenor of the book banning debates has changed. And so I profile um, colonial booksellers who are, dealing in what was then considered radical text about revolutionary kind of material. And then there are loyalist booksellers who are deemed as, traitors, and there are efforts to squash them. Sometimes bookstores are burned in these incendiary battles that take place not just in war, but are ideological battles. The American Revolution, for it to happen, enough colonists need to be convinced of separating. And this happens by way of literature in large part. So it's not surprising that many people have tried to censor what we're reading. I mentioned Francis Steloff a minute ago, and the kinds of stuff that was banned then would seem maybe silly to us now. James Joyce, for example, she was selling his works essentially illegally, Henry Miller, and others for many years. And then on a kind of different note, but speaking to a similar theme, I have a chapter on Nazi bookstores because I wanted readers to appreciate the kind of power of the bookstore. And we think of these spaces as warm and cozy and sweet and introducing us to great books that we want to curl up with. But the power of enriching one's life that's held by a bookstore can also be the power of, indoctrination, or at least politicizing and shaping our worldviews for better, and in the case of Nazism, worse. And what was amazing is that these Nazi bookstores were operating above ground. They were called the one I profile is called the Aryan Bookstore. It's on a main street in Los Angeles. This is not in any way kind of hidden. So there's a long history of sort of understanding the power of books, and at least inherently, everyone who's fighting to save books and grant librarians the freedom to just operate, and the people who are trying to ban books, all concede the same point, essentially, that books are really important and that they shape us and, they're critical. So maybe we can all sort of gather around that point. But even at doing all this history and thinking about censorship, it does feel like the moment we're in is exceptionally charged, and that many of the current debates about book banning, and especially the types of books that we're talking about, are of a kind of different variety than before, and speak more to our just sort of hyper partisan, politicized social media age, in some rather poisonous respects.
Now, you also document the rise of specialty bookstores, such as those dedicated to women or children, LGBTQ individuals, or people of color. Can you talk about that briefly and about their role in history?
So I profile one bookstore called the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookstore, which is in Greenwich Village and is one of the first gay bookstores in the country. And this is a time in which there are very few sort of visible community spaces for gay men and women to congregate, other than some in New York and other cities, gay bars or bathhouses or other kind of spaces. But this was a kind of, literary space that had at least the veneer of respectability. And the founder, Craig Rodwell, wanted to, awaken people like him, create what we would call now a safe space for people to learn about homosexuality, to meet other people, and to serve as this kind of anchor. And throughout the late 60s and 70s, there was a wave of such bookstores. Feminist bookstores cropped up all around the country. One I profile in the book happened to be called Amazon. And this is before, of course, the Amazon that we all know. And there's an interesting legal battle that eventually ensues between small feminist Amazon in Minneapolis and giant Amazon of Jeff Bezos. So, and these are just amazing spaces that, again, are not just selling books, but that are disseminating a political message, in this case about, female empowerment. And most of the books were written by women. They had author events, gatherings, just kind of magical spaces. And most of these more specialized bookstores largely disappeared when the big chains became popularized, first with the mall-based bookstores in the 80s, and then the sort of superstores of the 1990s.
So many of the independent bookstore owners seem to run their shops old school, without a lot of technology or data-driven marketing and the like, instead emphasizing solid customer service and relationship building, and really knowing the book content deeply. Are there any innovations that you saw as a rising trend that might help these businesses survive more, and that writers and editors should be aware of or better understand where those stores are at?
So I think there is this sense of sort of bookstores as being, not a very innovative kind of industry or innovative spaces technologically. And some of that I think is a fair kind of criticism and is also long held. So if you read kind of trade magazines and Publishers Weekly back in the 1930s, people are saying the same kind of thing about how other industries are much more innovative and transformative, and the book selling industry seems sort of stuck in the mud. But bookstores, as they began to decline or struggle or face competition from Amazon, have become much more nimble in many ways, I think. And it's very common for bookstores to hold all sorts of events. So there's classic author readings and signings, and there might be, children's story times. But there are a lot of bookstores that are also doing, other kinds of community events just to bring people into the shop. So maybe it's somebody who comes with a violin and just plays at 6 o'clock one night to create a kind of atmosphere and have people come in, or other ways to engage with books, not just book clubs, but sometimes literary tours or walking tours based around a book by a local author. So I think there's a lot of hungry booksellers that are looking to draw in patrons by creative kind of engagement and creative programming. And of course, bookstores are, in the wake of the pandemic, many of them began out of necessity to build online sales platforms to kind of amp up their, social media channels and find ways to connect with people, not just who are walking through the door. And many of those, I think, have been fruitful. But some of the charm, I think, for book browsers is a kind of technologically not free, but minimal kind of experience, right? We all know we can download ebooks and whatnot, but part of the appeal of walking into a bookstore is this sort of traditional sense, or something that feels almost nostalgic about seeing physical books and being surrounded by all these different colors and having our attention drawn there instead of to our phones and on a screen.
That, what do you want readers to come away with about bookselling, about book publishing, and bookshop ownership as you think of all? I mean, you have a lot of information in the book. Are there any particular points that you really want to make in those regards?
I would just say how weird bookstores are. And I mean that in the best positive sense, how special they are and how much they've contributed to American life and culture over the last hundreds of years. And that the only way they'll continue to contribute is if we decide to support them. So everyone knows every book can be bought on Amazon quite conveniently, sometimes more cheaply. And there are a lot of benefits to that for a lot of people within the publishing ecosystem, authors included. But I think it would be a real shame to live, in a bookstore-less world. So I hope we can come to appreciate how much bookstores have offered us so that we can continue to ensure their longevity.
Statistics showing a 60% drop in the number of bookstores in the past 20 years is pretty stark. Well, less than 6,000 exist now, even though there are more books published than ever, apparently. But as you write, people have predicted the end of bookstores for a very long time, including with the advent of Amazon, Target, and Costco. What does the history of bookstores tell us about their future? This is my final question.
Yeah, well, I think mostly it tells us that we can't predict the future and that historians like myself are no better at predicting the future than anybody else. But it's fun to try. And so I will say I am pretty sure that we'll never go back to the same number of brick and mortar bookstores that we once had, especially on a per capita basis. That seems very far-fetched. But I am comforted to have seen the decline slow down and in recent years really stabilize. And I think, as somebody who teaches college students, I think there's a yearning for in person, in real life, tactile, sensory experiences that can help us slow down. And there's no better place to do that than in a bookshop.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today. The book again is The Bookshop,
Yes. I was
by
told to have my
Dr.
copy
Evan
on
Friss.
hand.
Yes, we'll both hold it up here. And thank you again. Really appreciate your time, and the book is very interesting. So thank
It's
you for
been
taking
great to
time to write
talk.
it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.